Page 28. The power of society to influence our life chances. Do we simply decide our future? Among young men in their late 20s, part of the privilege of being white compared to being black is having double the odds of earning a college degree. Among African Americans, part of the disadvantage of being a person of color compared to being white is having 6 times the odds of being in jail or prison. While we all make choices, society sets the terrain of our life journey. Chapter Overview. Having learned to use a sociological perspective and how to make use of sociological theory, it is time to learn how sociologists do research. This chapter explains the process of sociological investigation, or how sociologists gather knowledge about the world. First, the chapter looks at science as a way of knowing and then discusses 2 limitations to scientific sociology that have given rise to 2 other approaches to knowing: interpretive sociology and critical sociology. Second, the chapter explains and illustrates 4 methods of data collection. While on a visit to Atlanta during the winter holiday season, the sociologist Lois Benjamin called up the mother of an old college friend. Benjamin was eager to learn about Sheba. Both women had dreamed about earning a graduate degree, landing a teaching job, and writing books. Now a successful university professor, Benjamin had seen her dream come true, but as she soon found out, this was not the case for Sheba. Benjamin recalled early signs of trouble. After college, Sheba had begun graduate work at a Canadian university, but in letters to Benjamin, Sheba became more and more critical of the world and seemed to be cutting herself off from others. Some classmates wondered if she was suffering from a personality disorder, but as Sheba saw it, the problem was racism. As an African American woman, she felt she was the target of racial hostility. Before long, she flunked out of school, blaming the failure on her white professors. At this point, she left North America, earning a PhD in England, and then settling in Nigeria. Benjamin had not heard from her friend. Obviously, Sheba was suffering from serious psychological problems. Having felt the sting of racism herself, Benjamin wondered if it might have played a part in Sheba's story. Partly as a tribute to her old friend, Benjamin set out to explore the effects of race in the lives of bright, well-educated African Americans in the United States. Benjamin knew that she was calling into question the common belief that race is less a barrier than it used to be, especially to talented African American, Wilson, 1978. But her own experiences, and Sheba's too, she believed, seemed to contradict such thinking. To test her ideas, Benjamin spent the next 2 years asking 100 successful African Americans across the country how race affected their lives. In the words of these talented 100 men and women, she found evidence that even among privileged African Americans, racism remains a heavy burden. Later in this chapter, we'll take a closer look at Lois Benjamin's research. For now, notice how the sociological perspective helped her spot broad social patterns in the lives of individuals. Just as important, Benjamin's work shows us the doing of sociology, the process of sociological investigation. Many people imagine scientists work only in laboratories, using complex equipment and carefully taking measurements. But as this chapter explains, although some sociologists do conduct scientific research in laboratories, most work on neighborhood streets, in homes and workplaces, in schools and hospitals, in bars and prisons. In short, wherever people can be found. This chapter examines the methods that sociologists use to conduct research. Along the way, we shall see that research involves not just ways of gathering information, but also controversies about values. Should researchers strive to be objective, or should they point to the need for change? Certainly, Lois Benjamin did not begin her study just to show that racism exists. She wanted to bring racism out in the open as a way to challenge it. We shall tackle questions of values after presenting the basics of sociological investigations. Page 30. Basics of Sociological Investigation. Bullet point 2.1. Explain how scientific evidence often challenges common sense. Sociological investigation starts with two simple requirements. The first was the focus of Chapter 1, apply the sociological perspective. This point of view reveals curious patterns of behavior all around us that call for further study. It was Lois Benjamin's sociological imagination that prompted her to wonder how race affects the lives of talented African Americans. This brings us to the second requirement. Be curious and ask questions. Benjamin wanted to learn more about how race affects people who are high achievers. She began by asking, who are the leaders of this nation's black community? What effect does being part of a racial minority have on their view of themselves? On the way white people perceive them and their work. Seeing the world sociologically and asking questions are basic to sociological investigation, and as we look for answers, we need to realize there are various kinds of truth. Truth is in quotes, not big T, little t. A third type of truth is based on simple agreement among ordinary people. Most of us in the United States would probably say we know that sexual intercourse among 10-year-old children is wrong. But why? Mostly because just about everyone we know says it is. People's truths differ the world over, and we often encounter facts at odds with our own sense of truth. Imagine you're a Peace Corps volunteer just arrived in a small, traditional village in Latin America. Your job is to help local people grow more crops. On your first day in the field, you observe a strange practice. After planting the seed, the farmer lays a dead fish on top of the soil. When you explain this, they explain that a fish is a gift to the god of harvest. A village elder adds sternly that the harvest was a poor one year when no fish were offered. From that society's point of view, using fish as gifts to the harvest god makes sense. The people believe in it, their experts endorse it, and everyone seems to agree that the system works. But with scientific training in agriculture, you have to shake your head and wonder, the scientific truth in the situation is something entirely different. The decomposing fish fertilize the ground, producing a better crop. Science represents a fourth way of knowing. Science is a logical system that bases knowledge on direct, systematic observation. Standing apart from faith, the wisdom of experts, and general agreement, scientific knowledge rests on empirical evidence, that is, information we can verify with our senses. Our Peace Corps example does not mean that people in traditional villages ignore what their senses tell them, or that members of technologically advanced societies use only science to know things. A medical researcher using science to develop a new drug for treating cancer, for example, may still practice her religion as a matter of faith, turn to financial experts when making decisions about money, and pay attention to the political opinions of her family and friends. In short, we all hold various kinds of truths at the same time. Common sense versus scientific evidence. Like the sociological perspective, scientific evidence sometimes challenges our common sense. Here are 6 statements that many North Americans assume are true. Poor people are far more likely than rich people to break the law. Not true. If you regularly watch television shows like Cops, you might think that police only arrest people from bad neighborhood. Chapter 9 on deviance explains that poor people do stand out in official arrest statistics. But research also shows that police and prosecutors are more likely to treat well-to-do people more leniently, as when a Hollywood celebrity is accused of shoplifting or drunk driving. Some laws are even written in a way that criminalizes poor people more and affluent people less. Point 2. The United States is a middle-class society in which most people are more or less equal. which is false. Data presented in Chapter 11 of Social Class in the United States show that the richest 5% of the U.S. family control about 65% of the nation's total wealth, but half of all families have scarcely any wealth at all. The gap between the richest and the average people in the United States has never been greater. Point 3. Most poor people don't want to work. Wrong. Research described in Chapter 11 indicates that this statement is true of some, but not most poor people. In fact, more than 4 in 10 poor people individuals in the United States are children and elderly who are not expected to work. Point 4. Differences in the behavior of females and males are just human nature. Wrong again. Much of what we call human nature is constructed by the society in which we live. As Chapter 3, entitled Culture, explains. Further, as Chapter 13, Gender Stratification, argues, some societies define feminine and masculine very differently than the way we do. Point 5. People change as they grow, losing many interests as they focus on their health. Not really. Chapter 15, entitled Aging and the Elderly, reports that aging does very little to change our personalities. Problems of health do increase in old age, but by and large, elderly people keep the distinctive personalities they have had throughout their adult lives. Point 6. Most people marry because they are in love. Not always. To members of our society, few statements are so obvious. Surprisingly, however, in many societies, marriage has little to do with love, as shown in Chapter 18, entitled Families, explains why. These examples confirm the old saying, it's not what we don't know that gets us into trouble as much as the things we do know that just aren't so. While growing up, we have all heard many widely accepted truths, been bombarded by expert advice in popular media, and felt pressure to accept the opinions of opinion around us. As adults, we need to evaluate more critically what we see, read, and hear. Sociology can help us do that. 3 ways to do sociology. Point 2.2. Describe sociology's 3 research orientations. Doing sociology means learning about the social world. There is more than one way to do this. Just as sociologists can use one or more theoretical approaches described in Chapter 1, the sociological perspective, they may also use different research orientations. The following sections describe 3 ways to do research. Positivist sociology, interpretive sociology, and critical sociology. Positivist sociology. Chapter 1 explained how early sociologists such as Auguste Comte and Emile Durkheim applied science to the study of society, just as natural scientists investigated the physical world. Positivist sociology. Chapter 1 explained how early sociologists such as Auguste Comte and Emile Durkheim applied science to the study of society, just as natural scientists investigate the physical world. Positivist sociology then is the study of society based on systematic observation of social behavior. A positivist orientation to the world assumes that an objective reality exists out there. The job of the scientist is to discover this reality by gathering empirical evidence and facts we can verify with our own senses, say by seeing, hearing, or touching. Concept variables and measurement. Let's take a closer look at how science works. A basic element of science is the concept, a mental construct that represents some part of the world in a simplified form. Sociologists use concepts to label aspects of social life, including the family and the economy, and to categorize people in terms of their gender and social class. A variable is a concept whose value changes from case to case. The familiar variable price, for example, has a value that changes from item to item in a supermarket. Similarly, we can use the concept of social class to describe people's social standings as upper, middle, working, or lower class. The use of variables depends on measurement, a procedure of determining the value of a variable in a specific case. Some variables are easy to measure when you step on a scale to see how much you weigh. But measuring sociological variables can be far more difficult. For example, how would you measure a person's social class? You might start by looking at the clothing that they wear, listening to how they speak, and noting where they live. Or trying to be more precise, you might ask about their income, occupation, and education. Because most variables can be measured in more than one way, sociologists often have to decide which factors to consider. For example, having a very high income might qualify a person as upper class, but what if the income comes from selling automobiles, an occupation most people think as middle class? Would having only an 8th grade education make the person lower class? In a case like this, sociologists usually combine the three measurements, income, occupation, and education, to determine the social class, as described in Chapter 10, Social Stratification, and Chapter 11, Social Class in the United States. Sociologists also face the problem with dealing with huge numbers of people. Huge. For example, how do you report income for thousands or even millions of U.S. families? Listing streams of numbers would carry very little meaning and tell us nothing about the population as a whole. To solve this problem, sociologists use descriptive statistics to state what average for a large number of people. To solve this problem, sociologists use descriptive statistics to state what is the average, in quotes, for a large number of people. The Seeing Sociology in Everyday Life box explains this. Seeing Sociology in Everyday Life. 3 useful and simple descriptive statistics. The admissions office at your school is preparing a new brochure, and as a part of your work-study job in that office, your supervisor asks you to determine the average salary received by last year's graduating class. To keep matters simple, assume that you only talk to 7 members of the class. A real-world study would require contacting many more. And gather the following data on their present income. And there is a table here that says 30,000, 42, 22, 165, 22, 35, 34. Various income levels. Sociologists use 3 different descriptive statistics to report averages. The simplest statistic is the mode, the value that occurs most often in the series of numbers. In this example, the mode is 22,000, since the value occurs 2 times and each of the others occur only once. If all values were to occur only once, there is no mode. If 2 different values each occur 2 or 3 times, there would be 2 modes. Although it is easy to identify, sociologists rarely use the mode because it reflects only some of the numbers and is therefore a crude measurement of the average, in quotes. A more common statistic, the mean, refers to an arithmetic average of a series of numbers calculated by adding all the values together and dividing the number by cases. The sum of the 7 incomes is $350,000. Dividing by 7 yields a mean income of $50,000. But notice that the mean, in this case, is not a very good average because it is higher than 6 of the 7 incomes and is not particularly close to any of the actual numbers. Because the mean is pulled up or down by an especially high or low number, in this case, the $165,000 paid to one graduate, an athlete who may have signed as a rookie to the Cincinnati Reds farm team. It can give a distorted picture of data that include one or more extreme scores. The median is the middle case, the value that occurs midway in a series of numbers arranged from lowest to highest. Here the median income for the 7 graduates is $34,000 because when the numbers are placed in order from lowest to highest, this occurs exactly in the middle with 3 incomes higher and 3 lower. With an even number of cases, the median's halfway between the two middle cases. Unlike the median is not affected by any extreme scores. In such cases, the median gives a better picture of what average than the mean. A lot of this is just like statistics. Your grade point average is an example of an average. Is it a mode, mean, median, or mean? Explain. This is, what do you think? These are questions. Sociologists generally use the median instead of the mean when they study people's income. Can you see why? Do a quick calculation of the mean, median, and mode for these simple numbers 1, 2, 5, 6, 6. So that box is a little statistics kind of, isn't it? Defining concepts. Measurement is always somewhat arbitrary because the value of any variable in part depends on how it is defined. In addition, it is easy to see that there is more than one way to measure abstract concepts as love, family, or intelligence. Good research, therefore, requires that sociologists operationalize a variable by specifying exactly what it is to be measured before assigning a value to a variable. Repeat. Good research, therefore, requires that sociologists' definition operationalize a variable, specifying exactly what it is to be measured before assigning a value to a variable. Before measuring the concept of social class, for example, you would have to decide exactly where you're going to measure, say income level, years of schooling, or occupational prestige. Sometimes sociologists measure several of these things. In such cases, they need to specify exactly how they plan to combine these variables into an overall score. The next time you read the results of a study, notice how the researchers operationalize each variable. How they define terms can greatly affect the results. Even the researchers at the U.S. Census Bureau sometimes struggle with operationalizing a concept. Take the case of measuring the racial and ethnic diversity of the U.S. population. Back in 1977, researchers at the U.S. Census Bureau defined race and ethnicity by asking people to make a choice from this list: white, black, Hispanic, Asian, or Pacific Islander, and American Indian or Alaska Native. One problem with the system is that someone can be both Hispanic and white or black. Similarly, people of Arab ancestry might not identify with any of those choices. Just as important, an increasing number of people are multiracial. In response to the changing face of the U.S. population, the 2000 census was the first one to allow people to describe their race and ethnicity by selecting more than one category from an expanded menu of choices, and almost 7 million people did. But many of these people selected both Hispanic and also a nationality such as Mexican. The result was an overcount of the number of multiracial people. In 2010, census researchers adjusted the process, providing clearer instructions and operationalizing the concept of race by offering 5 racial categories, quote, some other race, and 57 multiracial options. In 2010, 9 million people identified themselves as multiracial. By 2015, this figure had increased to about 9.4, about 3% of the population. Reliability and validity. For a measurement to be useful, it must be both reliable and valid. Reliability refers to the consistency in measurement. A measurement is reliable if repeated measurements give the same results time after time. But consistency does not guarantee validity, which means actually measuring exactly what you intend to measure. Getting a valid measurement is sometimes tricky. For instance, say you want to know just how religious the students at your college are. You might decide to ask the students how often they attend religious services. But is going to a church, temple, or mosque really the same thing as being religious? People may attend religious services because of deep personal beliefs, but they may also do it out of habit or because others pressure them to. And what about spiritual people who avoid organized religion together? Even as a measurement yields consistent results, making it reliable, it may not measure what we want to, therefore lacking validity. Chapter 19, entitled Religion, suggests that measuring religiosity should take account of not only participation in prayer services, but also the beliefs a person holds and the degree to which a person lives by religious convictions. Good sociological research depends on careful measurement, which is always a challenge to researchers. Relationships among variables. Once measurements are made, investigators can pursue the real payoff, seeing how variables are related. The scientific ideal is cause and effect, a relationship in which change in one variable causes change in another. Cause and effect relationships occur around us every day, as when studying hard for an exam results in a high grade. The variable that causes the change, in this case how much you study, is called the independent variable. The variable that changes, the exam grade, is called the dependent variable. The value of one variable depends on the value of another. Linking variables in terms of cause and effect is important because it allows us to predict the outcome of future events. If we know one thing, we can accurately predict another. For example, knowing that studying hard results in a better exam grade, we can predict with confidence that a typical individual who studies hard for the next exam will receive a higher grade than the person if that person does not study at all. Just because two variables change together does not mean that they are linked by a cause and effect relationship. For example, sociologists have long observed that juvenile delinquency is more common among young people who live in crowded housing. Say we operationalize the variable juvenile delinquency as the number of times a person under age of 18 has been arrested, and we define crowded housing by a home's number of square feet of living space per person. It turns out these variables are related. Delinquency rates are high in densely populated neighborhoods. But should we conclude that crowding in a home, in this case the independent variable, is what causes delinquency, the dependent variable? Not necessarily. Correlation is a relationship in which two variables change together. We know that density and delinquency are correlated because they change together, as shown in Part A of Figure 2.1. This relationship may mean that crowding causes more arrests, but it could mean that some other third factor is causing a change in both of the variables under observation. To identify a third variable, think of what kinds of people live in crowded housing. People with less money and few choices, aka the poor. Poor children are also more likely to end up with police records. In reality, crowded housing and juvenile delinquency are found together because both are found by a third factor, poverty, as shown in Part B of Figure 2.1. In short, the apparent connection between crowding and delinquency is explained away by a third variable, low income, that causes them to both change. So our original connection turns out to be a spurious correlation, an apparent but false relationship between two or more variables that is caused by some other variable. Exposing a correlation as spurious requires a bit of detective work, assisted by a technique called control, holding constant all variables except one in order to see clearly the effect of that variable. In our example, we suspect that income level may be causing a spurious link between housing density and delinquency. To check whether the correlation between delinquency and crowding is spurious, we control for income. That is, we hold income constant by looking at only young people of one income level. If the correlation between delinquency and density remains, that is, if young people of the same income level living in more crowded housing show higher rates of arrest than young people in less crowded housing, we have more reason to think that crowding does, in fact, cause delinquency. But if the relationship disappears when we control for income, as shown in part C of Figure 2.1, page 34, then we know we're dealing with a spurious correlation. In fact, research shows that correlation between crowding and delinquency just disappears if income is controlled. So we have now sorted out the relationship among three variables as illustrated in part D of the figure. Housing density and juvenile delinquency have a spurious correlation. Evidence shows that both variables rise or fall according to income. To sum up, correlation means only that two variables change together. To establish cause and effect, three requirements must be met. A demonstrated correlation, an independent causal variable that occurs before the dependent variable, and no evidence that a third variable could be causing a spurious correlation between the two. Natural scientists usually have an easier time than social scientists in identifying cause and effect relationships because most natural scientists work in a laboratory where they can control variables. Carrying out research in a workplace or on the streets, however, makes control very difficult. So sociologists often have to settle for demonstrating only correlation. Also, human behavior is highly complex, involving dozens of causal variables at one time, so establishing all the cause and effect relationships in any situation is extremely difficult. The ideal of objectivity. 10 students are sitting around a dorm lounge, discussing the dream vacation spot for the upcoming spring break. Do you think one place will end up being everyone's clear favorite? That hardly seems likely. In scientific terms, each of the 10 people probably operationalize the concept of dream vacation differently. For one, it might be a deserted, sunny beach in Mexico. For another, the choice might be New Orleans, a lively city with a very active social scene. For still another, hiking the Rocky Mountains below snow-capped peaks may be the choice. Like so many other bests in life, the best vacations turn out to be mostly a matter of individual taste. Personal values are fine when it comes to choosing travel destinations, but they pose a challenge to scientific research. Remember, science assumes that reality is out there. Scientists need to study this reality without changing it in any way, and so they strive for objectivity, personal neutrality in conducting research. So that is a definition term, objectivity, personal neutrality in conducting research. Objectivity means that researchers carefully hold to scientific procedures and do not let their own attitudes and beliefs influence the results. Scientific objectivity is an ideal rather than reality, of course, because no one can be completely neutral. Even the topic someone chooses to study reflects a personal interest of one sort or another, as Lois Benjamin showed us in the reasons for her decision to investigate race. But the scientific ideal is to keep a professional distance or a sense of detachment from the results, however they turn out. With this ideal in mind, you should do your best when conducting research to see that conscious or unconscious biases do not distort your findings. As an extra precaution, many researchers openly state their personal leanings in the research reports so that readers can interpret the conclusions with considerations in mind. The German sociologist Max Weber expected that people would select their research topics according to their personal beliefs and interests. Why else, after all, would one person study world hunger, another investigate the effects of racism, and still another examine how children manage in one-parent families? Knowing that people select topics that are value relevant, Weber urged researchers to be value-free in their investigations. Only by controlling their personal feelings and opinions, as we would expect any professionals to do, can researchers study the world as it is rather than tell us how they think it should be. This detachment, for Weber, is a crucial element of science that sets it apart from politics. Politicians are committed to particular outcomes. Scientists try to maintain an open mind about the result of their investigations, whatever they may turn out to be. Weber's argument still carries much weight. although most sociologists admit that we can never be completely value-free or even aware of all our biases. Keep in mind, however, that sociologists are not average people. Most are white, highly educated, and much more politically liberal than the population as a whole. Remember that sociologists, like everyone else, are influenced by their social backgrounds. One way to limit distortion caused by personal values is replication. Definition term replication means repetition. Page 36. Keep in mind that following the logic of science does not guarantee objective, absolute truth. What science offers is an approach to knowledge that is self-correcting so that in the long run, researchers stand a good chance of limiting their bias. Objectivity and truth lie. Then, not in any one study but in scientific process itself as it continues over time. Some limitations of scientific sociology. Science is one important way of knowing, yet applied to social life, science has several important limitations. Point 1. Human behavior is too complex for sociologists to predict any individual's actions precisely. Astronomers calculate the movement of objects in skies with remarkable precision, but comets and planets are non-thinking objects. Humans, by contrast, have their own minds, so no two people react to any event, whether it be a sports victory or natural disaster, in exactly the same way. Sociologists must therefore be satisfied with knowing that the categories of people typically act in one way or another. Sociologists must therefore be satisfied with showing that categories of people typically act in one way or another. This is not a failing of sociology, it simply reflects that the fact that we study creative, spontaneous people. Point 2. Because humans respond to their surroundings, the presence of a researcher may affect the behavior being studied. An astronomer's gaze has no effect on a distant comet, but most people react to being observed. Try staring at someone for a few minutes and see for yourself. People being watched may become anxious, angry, or defensive. Others may be especially friendly or helpful. The act of studying people can cause their behavior to change. Point 3. Social patterns vary. What is true in one time or place may not hold true in another. The same laws of physics will apply tomorrow as today, and they hold true all around the world. But human behavior is so variable, there are no universal sociological laws. Point 4. Because sociologists are part of the social world they study, they can never be 100% value-free when conducting social research. Barring a laboratory mishap, chemists are rarely personally affected by what goes on in their test tubes, but sociologists live in their test tube, the society they study. Therefore, social scientists may find it difficult to control or even recognize personal values that may distort their work. Section Interpretive Sociology. Not all sociologists agree that science is the only way, or even the best way, to study human society. This is because, unlike planets or other elements of the natural world, humans do not simply move around as objects in the ways that can be measured. Even more important, people are active creatures who attach meanings to their behavior, and meaning is not easy to observe directly. Therefore, sociologists have developed a second research orientation known as interpretive sociology, which is the study of society that focuses on the meaning people attach to their social world. Max Weber, German, so the W sounds different. I need to look it up. The pioneer of this framework argued that the proper focus of sociology is interpretation, or understanding the meaning that people create in their everyday lives. Interpretive sociology does not reject science completely, but it does change the focus of research. In interpretive sociology differs from positivist sociology in 4 ways. First, positivist sociology focuses on actions, on what people do, because that is what we can observe directly. Interpretive sociology, by contrast, focuses on people's understanding of their actions and their surroundings. Second, positivist sociology claims that objective reality exists out there, but interpretive sociology counters that reality is subjective and constructed by people in the course of their everyday lives. Third, positivist sociology tends to favor quantitative data, numerical measurements of people's behavior, while interpretive sociology favors qualitative or researchers' perceptions of how people understand their world. Fourth, the positivist orientation is best suited to research in a laboratory where investigators conducting an experiment stand back and take careful measurements. On the other hand, interpretive orientation claims that we learn more by interacting with people, focusing on subjective meaning, and learning how they make sense of their everyday lives. As the chapter will explain, this type of research often uses personal interviews or fieldwork and is best carried out in a natural or everyday settings. Weber's concepts of Verstehen. Max Weber believed the key to interpretive sociology lay in Verstehen, the German word for understanding. The interpretive sociologist does not observe what people do, but also tries to understand why they do it. The thoughts and feelings of subjects, which scientists tend to dismiss because they are so difficult to measure, are the focus of the interpretive sociologist's attention. Interpretive sociology does not reject the practice of observing behavior or even the use of numerical measurements. Many sociologists combine a positivist focus on observing behavior patterns with an interpretive effort to study how people understand their behavior in their social world. Critical sociology. Like the interpretive orientation, critical sociology developed in reaction to what many sociologists saw as limitations of positivist sociology. In this case, however, the problem involves a central principle of scientific research: objectivity. Positivist sociology holds that reality is out there. They put it in quotes. I don't know what out there. I guess out there is like some sort of weird, not analogy, but colloquialism or something. Reality is out there, just like the truth. And the researchers tasked to study and document how society works. But Karl Marx, who founded critical orientation, rejected the idea that society exists as a natural system with a fixed order. To assume that society is somehow fixed, he claimed, is the same as saying that society cannot be changed. Positivist sociology, from this point of view, supports the status quo. Critical sociology, by contrast, is the study of society that focuses on the need for social change. The importance of change. Rather than asking the scientific question, how does society work? Critical sociologists ask moral and political questions such as, should society exist in its present form, and why can't our society have less inequality? Their answers to these questions typically are that society should not remain as it is and that we should try to make our world more socially equal. Critical sociology does not reject science completely. Marx, like critical sociologists today, used the scientific method to learn about inequality. But critical sociology does not reject positivist claim that researchers should try to be objective and limit their work to studying the status quo. One recent account of this orientation, echoing Marx, claims that the point of sociology is not just to research the social world, but to change it in the direction of the democracy and social justice. In making value judgments about how society should be improved, critical sociology rejects Weber's goal that researchers should be value-free and emphasizes instead that they should be social activists in pursuit of greater social equality. Sociologists using the critical orientation seek to change not just society, but also the character of research itself. They often identify personally with their research subjects and encourage them to help them encourage them to help decide what to study and how to do work. Typically, researchers and subjects use their findings to provide a voice for less powerful people, and to advance political goal of a more equal society. Sociology as politics. Positivist sociologists object to taking sides in this way, charging that to the extent that critical sociology, whether feminist, Marxist, or some other critical orientation, becomes political. It lacks objectivity and it cannot correct for its own biases. Critical sociologists replied that all research is political or biased. Either it calls for change or it does not. Sociologists thus have no choice about their work being political, but they can choose which positions to support. Critical sociology is an activist orientation that ties knowledge to action and seeks not to understand the world as it exists, but also to improve it. Researchers using a critical approach often take a positivist interest in measuring some social patterns such as income inequality. But the motivation for the research is to bring about some change, typically change towards a society with greater equality. In general terms, then, positivist sociology appears to researchers with non-political or... Is there a link between research orientations and sociological theory? There is no precise connection, but each of the three research orientations, positivist, interpretive, and critical, does stand closer to one of the theoretical approaches presented in Chapter 1, the sociological perspective. The positivist orientation has an important factor in common with the structural, functional approach. Both are concerned with understanding society as it is. In the same way, interpretive sociology has a common with the symbolic interaction approach, a focus on the meaning people attach to their social world. Finally, critical sociology has in common with the social conflict approach the fact that both seek to reduce social inequality. Those sentences suck. Finally, critical sociology has in common with social conflict approach the fact that both seek to reduce social inequality. I should just say, both critical sociology... this part sucks. Issues affecting sociological research. 2.3. Identify the importance of gender and ethics in sociological research. Both gender and ethics play important parts in sociological investigation. We deal with these factors in turn. Gender. Sociologists also know that research is affected by gender, the personal traits and social positions that members of a society attach to being male or female. Like just now, it says female or male, and I read male or female. Is that some sort of gender bias, something going on? Anyways, point number 1. Androcentricity. Literally, focus on the male refers to approaching an issue from a male's perspective. Sometimes researchers act as if only men's activities are important, ignoring what women do. For years, researchers studying occupations focused on paid work of men and overlooked the housework and childcare traditionally performed by women. Research that seeks to understand human behavior cannot ignore half of humanity. Gynocentricity, seeing the world from a female perspective, can also limit good sociological investigation. However, in our male-dominated society, this problem arises less often. Point number 2, overgeneralizing. This problem occurs when researchers use data drawn from people of only one sex to support conclusions about humanity or society. Gathering information by talking to only male students, then drawing conclusions from an entire campus about an entire campus would be an example of overgeneralizing. Point 3, Gender blindness. Failing to consider gender at all is known as gender blindness. As it is evident throughout this text, the lives of men and women differ in countless ways. A study of growing old in the United States might suffer from gender blindness if it overlooked the fact that most elderly men live with their wives, but elderly women typically live alone. Point number 4, double standards. Researchers must be careful not to distort what they study by judging men and women differently. For example, a family researcher who labels a couple as a man and wife may define the man as the head of the household and treat him as important, paying little attention to a woman whom the researcher assumes simply plays a supporting role. Point number 5, interference. Another way gender can distort a study is if a subject reacts to the sex of the researcher, interfering with the research operation. While studying a small community in Sicily, for example, Maureen Giovannini found that many men treated her as a woman rather than a researcher. Some thought it was wrong for an unmarried woman to speak privately with a man. Others denied Giovannini access to places they considered off limits to women. There is nothing wrong with focusing research on people of one sex or another, but all sociologists, as well as people who read their work, should be mindful of how gender can affect an investigation. Research ethics. Like all researchers, sociologists must be aware that researchers can harm as well as help subjects or communities. For this reason, the American Sociological Association, the ASA, the major professional association of sociologists in North America, has established formal guidelines for conducting research, 1997. Sociologists must try to be skillful and fair-minded in their work. They must disclose all research findings without omitting significant data. They should make their results available to other sociologists who may want to conduct a similar study. Sociologists must also make sure that the subjects taking part in a research project are not harmed and that they must stop their work right away if they suspect that a subject is at risk of harm. Researchers are also required to protect the privacy of anyone involved in a research project, even if they come under pressure from authorities such as the police or the courts to release confidential information. Researchers must also get the informed consent of participants, which means that the subjects must understand the responsibilities and risks that the research involves before agreeing to take part. Another guideline concerns funding. Sociologists must reveal in their published results the sources of all financial support. They must avoid accepting money from a source if there is a question of conflict of interest. For example, researchers must never accept funding from an organization that seeks to influence the research results for its own purposes. The federal government also plays a part in research ethics. Colleges and universities that seek federal funding for research involved in human subjects must have an institutional review board, IRB, to review grant applications and ensure that the research will not violate ethical standards. Finally, there are global dimensions to research ethics. Before beginning research in another country, an investigator must become familiar enough with a society to understand what the people there are likely to regard as a violation of privacy or a source of personal danger. In a diverse society such as the United States, the same rules applies to studying people whose cultural backgrounds differ from your own. The Thinking About Diversity box offers some tips on sensitivity outsiders should apply when studying Hispanic communities. We'll now read the Thinking About Diversity, Race, Class, and Gender box. Studying the lives of Hispanics. George. If you are going to include Latinos in your research, you need to learn a little about their culture. Mark. I'm interviewing lots of different families. What's special about interviewing Latinos? George. Sit down and I'll tell you a few things you need to know. There's a conversation between George and Mark. Because U.S. society is racially, ethically, and religiously diverse, all of us have to work with people who differ from ourselves. The same is true of sociologists. Learning in advance the ways of life of any category of people can ease the research process and ensure there will be no hard feelings when the work is finished. Gerardo Marin and Barbara Van Os Marin have identified 5 areas of concern in conducting research with Hispanic people. Be careful with terms. Point 1. Be careful with terms. The Marins point out that the term Hispanic is a label of convenience used by the U.S. Census Bureau. Few people of Spanish descent think of themselves as Hispanic. Most identify with a particular country, generally with a Latin American nation such as Mexico, Argentina, or with Spain. Point 2. Be aware of cultural differences. By and large, the United States is individualistic and competitive. Many Hispanics, by contrast, place more value on cooperation and community. An outsider may judge the behavior of a Hispanic subject as a conformist or overly trusting when in fact the person is simply trying to be helpful. Researchers should also realize Hispanic respondents might express agreement with a particular statement merely out of politeness. Point 3. Anticipate family dynamics. Generally speaking, Hispanic cultures have strong family loyalties. Asking subjects to reveal information about another family member may make them uncomfortable or even angry. The Marins add, in the home, a researcher requests to speak privately with a Hispanic woman may provoke suspicion or outright disapproval from her husband or father. Point 4. Take your time. Spanish cultures, the Marins explain, tend to place the quality of relationships above simply getting a job done. A non-Hispanic researcher who tries to hurry an interview with a Hispanic family out of a desire not to delay the family's dinner may be rude for not proceeding at a more sociable and relaxed pace. Point 5, think about personal space. Finally, Hispanics typically maintain closer physical contact than many non-Hispanics. Research methods. Page 41, topic 2.4. Explain why a researcher might choose each of the sociology's research method. A research method is a systematic plan for doing research. 4 commonly used methods of sociological investigation are experiments, surveys, participant observation, and the use of existing data. None is better or worse than other. Rather, just as a carpenter selects a particular tool for a specific task, researchers select a method or mix several methods according to whom they want to study and what they wish to learn. Testing a hypothesis. The experiment. The experiment is a research method for testing a hypothesis. The experiment. The experiment is a research method for investigating cause and effect under highly controlled conditions. Experiments closely follow the logic of science, and experimental research is typically explanatory, asking not just what happened but also why. In most cases, researchers create an experiment to test a hypothesis, a statement of a possible relationship between 2 or more variables. A hypothesis typically takes the form of if-then statements. If this particular thing were to happen, then that particular thing will result. In an experiment, a researcher gathers the evidence needed to reject or not to reject the hypothesis in 4 steps. State which variable is the independent variable, the cause of the change, and which is the dependent variable, the effect, the thing that is changed. Let me read that again. In an experiment, a researcher gathers evidence needed to reject or not reject the hypothesis in 4 steps. The first step is state which variable is the independent variable, the thing that may cause a change, and which is the dependent, the effect, that thing that is going to be changed. Part 2, or step 2, measure the initial value of the dependent variable. Step 3, expose the dependent variable to the independent variable, the cause or treatment. Step 4, measure the dependent variable again to see what change, if any, took place. If the expected change took place, the experiment supports the hypothesis. If not, the hypothesis must be modified. But a change in the dependent variable could be due to something other than the supposed cause. Think back to our discussion of spurious correlations. To be certain that they identify the correct cause, researchers carefully control other factors that might affect the outcome of the experiment. Such control is easiest to achieve in a laboratory, a setting specially constructed to neutralize outside influences. Another strategy to gain control is dividing subjects into experimental group and a control group. Early in the study, the researcher measures the dependent variable for subjects in both groups, but later exposes only the experimental group to the independent variable or treatment. The control group typically gets a placebo, a treatment that the members of the group think is the same, but really has no effect on the experiment. Then the investigator measures the subjects in both groups again. Any factor occurring during the course of the research that influences people in the experimental group, say a news event, would do the same to those in the control group, thus controlling or washing out the factor. By comparing the before and after measurements of the two groups, a researcher can learn how much of the change is due to the independent variable. The Hawthorne effect. Researchers need to be aware that the subject's behavior may change simply because they are getting special attention, as one classic experiment revealed. In the late 1930s, the Western Electric Company hired researchers to investigate worker productivity in its Hawthorne factory near Chicago. One experiment tested the hypothesis that increasing the available lighting would raise worker output. First, researchers measured worker productivity or output. Then they increased the lighting and measured output a second time. Productivity had gone up, a result that supported the hypothesis. Illustration of an experiment, the Stanford County Prison. Prisons can be violent settings, but is this due simply to the bad people who end up there? Or, as Philip Zimbardo suspected, does the prison itself somehow cause violent behavior? This question led Zimbardo to devise a fascinating experiment which he called the Stanford County Prison. Zimbardo thought that once inside a prison, even emotionally healthy are likely to engage in violence. Thus, Zimbardo treated the prison settings as the independent variable capable of causing violence, the dependent variable. To test this hypothesis, Zimbardo's research constructed a realistic-looking prison in the basement of a psychology building on the campus of California's Stanford University. Then they placed an ad in the local newspaper offering to pay young men to help in a 2-week research project. To each of the 70 who responded, they administered a series of physical and psychological tests and then selected the healthiest 24. The next step was to randomly assign half of the men to be prisoners and half to be guards. The plan called for the guards and prisoners to spend the next 2 weeks in the mock prisons. The prisoners began their experiment soon afterward when the city police, quote, arrested them at their homes. After searching and handcuffing the men, the police drove them to the local police station where they were fingerprinted. Then, police transported their captives to the Stanford prison where the guards locked them up. Zimbardo started his video camera rolling and watched to see what would happen. The experiment turned into more than anyone had bargained for. Both guards and prisoners soon became embittered and hostile toward one another. Guards humiliated the prisoners by assigning them tasks such as cleaning out toilets with their bare hands. The prisoners resisted and insulted the guards. Within 4 days, the researchers removed 5 prisoners who displayed extreme emotional depression, crying, rage, and acute anxiety. Before the end of the first week, the situation had become so bad that the researchers had to cancel the experiment. Zimbardo explained, the ugliest, most base pathological side of human nature surfaced. We were horrified because we saw some boys, guards, treat others as if they were despicable animals, taking pleasure in cruelty, while other boys, prisoners, became servile, dehumanized robots who thought only of escape, of their own survival, and of their mounting hatred for the guards. The events that unfolded at the Stanford County Prison supported Zimbardo's hypothesis that prison violence is rooted in the social character of the jail setting, not in the personalities of the guards and prisoners. This finding raises questions about our society's prisons, suggesting the need for basic reform. Notice, too, that this experiment shows the potential of research to threaten the physical and mental well-being of the subject. Such dangers are not as obvious as they were in this case. Therefore, researchers must carefully consider potential harm to subjects at all stages of their work and halt any study, as Zimbardo did, if subjects suffer any harm of any kind. Evaluate. In carrying out the Stanford County Prison study, the researchers chose to do an experiment because they were interested in testing a hypothesis. In this case, Zimbardo and his colleagues wanted to find out if the prison setting itself, rather than the personalities of individual guards and prisoners, is the cause of prison violence. The fact that the prison erupted in violence, even when using guards and prisoners with healthy profiles, supports their hypothesis. What was Zimbardo's conclusion? How might Zimbardo's findings help explain abuse of Iraqi prisoners by U.S. soldiers after the 2003 invasion? Asking questions. Survey research, page 42. A survey is a research method in which subjects respond to a series of statements or questions on a questionnaire or in an interview. The most widely used of all research methods, the survey is well suited to studying what cannot be observed directly, such as political attitudes or religious beliefs. Sometimes surveys provide clues about cause and effect, but typically they yield descriptive findings, otherwise painting a picture of people's view on some issue. Population and sample. A survey targets some population, the people who are the focus of the research. Lois Benjamin, in her study of racism, described at the beginning of her this chapter, studied a select population, talented African Americans. Other surveys, such as political polls that predict election results, treat every adult in the country as the population. Obviously, contacting millions of people is impossible for even the best funded and most patient researchers. Fortunately, there is an easier way that yields accurate results. Researchers collect data from a sample, a part of the population that represents the whole. Benjamin chose 100 talented African Americans as her sample. National political polls typically survey a sample of about 1,000 people. Everyone uses the logic of sampling all the time. If you look at the students sitting near you and notice 5 or 6 heads nodding off, you might conclude that the class finds the day's lectures dull. In reaching this conclusion, you are making judgments about all the people in the class from observing some of your classmates. But how can researchers be sure that a sample really represents the entire population? One way is through random sampling, in which researchers draw a sample from the population at random so that every person in the population has an equal chance of being selected. The mathematical laws of probability dictate that a random sample is likely to represent the population as a whole. Selecting a random sample usually involves listing everyone in the population and using a computer to make random selections to make up the sample. Beginning researchers sometimes make the mistake of assuming that randomly walking up to people on the street or in the mall produces a sample that is representative of the entire city. But this technique does not produce a random sample because it does not give every person an equal chance to be included in the study. For one thing, on any street or any mall, whether in a rich neighborhood or near a college campus, we will find more of some kinds of people than others. The fact that researchers may find some categories of people to be approachable than others is another source of bias. Although constructing a good sample is no simple task, it offers a considerable savings in time and expense. We are spared the tedious work of contacting everyone in the population, yet we can obtain essentially the same results. Using questionnaires. Selecting subjects is just the first step in carrying out a survey. Also needed is a plan for asking questions and recording answers. Most surveys use a questionnaire for this purpose. A questionnaire is a series of written questions a researcher presents to subjects. One type of questionnaire provides not only the questions, but also a selection of fixed responses, similar to a multi-choice examination. This closed-ended format makes it fairly easy to analyze the results, and by narrowing the range of responses, it can also distort the findings. For example, Frederick Lorenz and Brent Bruton found that the number of hours per week students say they study for a college course depends on the options offered to them on the questionnaire. When the researchers presented students with options ranging from 1 hour to less than 9 hours or more, 75% said that they studied 4 hours or less per week. But when subjects in a comparable group were given choices from 4 hours or less to 12 hours or longer, a higher figure that suggests students should study more, they suddenly became more studious. Only 34% reported that they study 4 hours or less each week. A second type of questionnaire using open-ended format allows subjects to respond freely, expressing various shades of opinion. The drawback of this approach is that the researcher has to make sense of what can be a very wide range of answers. The researcher must also decide how to present questions to subjects. Most often, researchers use a self-administered survey, mailing or emailing questionnaires to respondents and asking them to complete the form and send it back. Since no researcher is present when subjects read the questionnaire, it must be both inviting and clearly written. Pre-testing, a self-administered questionnaire with a small number of people before sending it to the entire sample can prevent the costly problem of finding out too late that the instructions or questions were confusing. Using the mail or email allows a researcher to contact a large number of people over a wide geographic area at a minimal expense. But many people who receive such questionnaires treat them as junk mail, so typically no more than half are completed and returned, as in the 2010 U.S. Census Bureau forms, which only 74% of people return them. Researchers must follow up mailings to urge reluctant subjects to respond. Finally, keep in mind that many people are not capable of completing a questionnaire on their own. Young children obviously cannot, nor can many hospital patients or a surprising number of adults who simply lack the required reading and writing skills. Conducting interviews. An interview is a series of questions a researcher asks respondents in person. In a closed format design, researchers read a question or statement and then ask the subject to select a response from several that are presented. More commonly, however, interviews are open-ended so that subjects can respond as they choose, and researchers can probe with the follow-up question. In either case, the researcher must guard against influencing a subject, which can be as easy as raising an eyebrow when a person begins to answer. Although subjects are more likely to complete a survey if contacted personally by a researcher, interviews have some disadvantages. Tracking people down can be costly and takes time, especially if the subjects do not live in the same area. Telephone interviews allow far greater reach, but the impersonality of cold calls by telephone can lower the response rate. In both questionnaires and interviews, how a question is worded greatly affects how people answer. For example, when asked during the 2008 presidential campaign if Barack Obama's race would make them less likely to vote for him, only 3 to 4% said yes. Yet, if the question was asked if the United States is ready to elect a black president, then 20% expressed some doubt. Similarly, if researchers asked U.S. adults if they support our military, a large majority of people say yes. Yet when researchers asked if they supported what the military was trying to do in Iraq, most said no. When it comes to survey questions, the exact wording will always affect responses. This is especially true if emotionally loaded language is used. Any word that trigger an emotional response in the subject will sway the results. For instance, using the expression welfare mothers rather than women who receive public assistance adds an emotional element to a question that encourages people to express a negative attitude. Another problem is that researchers may confuse responders by asking a double question. Do you think the government should reduce the deficit by cutting spending and raising taxes? The issue here is that a subject could be very well agree with one part of the question but not the other, so that forcing a subject to say yes or no distorts the opinion the researcher is trying to measure. Conducting a good interview means that standardizing the technique, treating all subjects the same way. Conducting a good interview means standardizing the technique, treating all subjects in the same way. But this too can be problematic. Drawing people out requires establishing rapport, which in turn depends on responding naturally to the particular person being interviewed, as you would in a normal conversation. In the end, researchers have to decide where to strike the balance between uniformity and rapport. Illustration of survey research, studying the African American life. This chapter begins by explaining how Lois Benjamin came to investigate the effects of racism on the talented African American men and women. Benjamin suspected that personal achievement did not prevent hostility based on skin color. She believed this because of her own negative experiences after becoming the first black professor at the University of Tampa. But was she the exception to the rule? To answer this question, Benjamin set out to discover whether, and if so, how, racism affected other successful African Americans. Benjamin chose to interview subjects rather than distribute a questionnaire because she wanted to talk with her subjects, ask follow-up questions, and pursue topics that might come up in a conversation. A second reason Benjamin favored interviews over questionnaires is that racism is a sensitive topic. A supportive investigator can make it easier for subjects to respond to painful questions more freely. Because conducting interviews takes a great deal of time, Benjamin had to limit the number of people in her study. Benjamin settled for a sample of 100 men and women. Even this small number kept Benjamin busy for more than 2 years as she scheduled interviews, traveled all over the country, and met with her respondents. She spent 2 more years analyzing the tapes of her interviews, deciding what the hours of talk told her about racism, and writing up her result. Benjamin began by interviewing people she knew and asking them to suggest others. This strategy is called snowball sampling because the number of individuals included grows rapidly over time. Snowball sampling is an easy way to do research. We begin with familiar people who introduce us to their friends and colleagues. The drawback is that the snowball sampling rarely produces a sample that is representative of the larger population. Benjamin's samples probably contained many like-minded individuals, and it was certainly biased towards people willing to talk openly about race. She understood these problems and tried to include in her sample people of both sexes, of different ages, and from different regions of the country. The Thinking About Diversity box on page 46 represents a statistical profile of Benjamin's responses and some tips on how to read tables. Benjamin based all her interviews on a series of questions with an open-ended format so that her subjects could say whatever they wished. As usually happens, the interviews took place in a wide range of settings. She met subjects in their offices, hers or theirs, in hotel rooms, and in cars. So as not to be distracted by having to take notes, Benjamin tape recorded the conversations, which lasted from 2.5 to 3 hours. As research ethics demand, Benjamin offered full anonymity to participants. Even so, many, including notables such as Vernon E. Jordan Jr., former president of the National Urban League, and Yvonne Walker Taylor, first woman president of the Wilberforce University, were used to being in the public eye and allowed Benjamin to use their names. What surprised Benjamin most about her research was how eagerly people responded to her request for an interview. These normally busy men and women seemed to want to get out of their way to contribute to her project. Benjamin reports, too, that once the interviews were underway, many became very emotional and about 40 of her 100 subjects cried. For them, apparently, the research provided a chance to release feelings and share experiences that they had never revealed to anyone before. How did Benjamin respond to the expression of such sentiments? She reports that she cried right along with her respondents. Of the research orientations described earlier in the chapter, you will see that Benjamin's studies fits best under interpretive sociology. She explored what race meant to her subject. And critical sociology, she undertook study partly to document that racial prejudices still exist. Many of her subjects reported fearing that race might someday undermine their success, and others spoke of a race-based glass ceiling preventing them from reaching the highest positions in our society. Benjamin concluded that despite the improving social standing of African Americans, black people in the United States still feel the sting of racial hostility. Evaluate. Professor Benjamin chose the survey as her method because she wanted to ask a lot of questions and gather information from her subjects. Certainly, some of the information she collected could have been done using a questionnaire, but she decided to carry out interviews because she was dealing with a complex and sensitive topic. Interacting with her subjects one-on-one for several hours, Benjamin could put them at ease, discuss personal matters, and ask them follow-up questions. Check your learning. Do you think this research could have been carried out by a white sociologist? Why or why not? In the field, participant observation, page 46. Lois Benjamin's research demonstrates that sociological investigation takes place not only in laboratories but also in the field, that is, where people carry on their everyday lives. The most widely used strategy for a field study is participant observation, a research method in which investigators systematically observe people while joining them in their routine activities. This method allows researchers an inside look at their social life in any natural setting, from a nightclub to a religious seminary. Sociologists call their account of social life in some settings a case study. Cultural anthropologists use participant observation to study other societies, calling this method fieldwork and calling their research results ethnography. At the beginning of a field of study, most investigators do not have a specific hypothesis in mind. In fact, they may not yet realize what the important questions will turn out to be. Thus, most participant observation is exploratory and descriptive. As the name suggests, participant observation has two sides. On one hand, getting an insider's look depends on becoming a participant in the setting, hanging out with the research subject and trying to act, think, and even feel the way they do. Compared to experiments and survey research, participant observation has hard and fast rules, but it is precisely this flexibility has few hard and fast rules. It's this flexibility that allows investigators to explore the unfamiliar and adapt to the unexpected. Unlike other research methods, participant observation may require that the researcher enter the setting not for a week or two, but for months or even years. At the same time, however, the researcher must maintain some distance while acting as an observer, mentally stepping back to record field notes and later to interpret them. Because the investigator must play the participant to win the acceptance and gain access to the people's lives, and play the observer to maintain the distance needed for thoughtful analysis, there is an inherent tension in this method. Carrying out the twin roles of insider participation and outsider observer often comes down to a series of careful compromises. Most sociologists perform participant observation alone, so they, and the readers too, must remember the results depend on the work of a single person. Participant observation usually falls within interpretive sociology, yielding mostly qualitative data, the researcher's account of people's lives and what they think of themselves and the world around them, although researchers sometimes collect quantitative numerical data. From a scientific point of view, participant observation is a soft method that relies heavily on personal judgment and lacks scientific rigor. Yet, its personal approach is also a strength, where a high-profile team of sociologists administering formal surveys might disrupt many social settings. A sensitive participant observer can often gain important insight into people's behavior. Illustration of participant observation, studying the homeless in Jackson, Mississippi. Did you ever wonder what life was like in some new and unfamiliar place? For one young sociologist, this question has been at the center of his life. Joseph Pico Ewudzie was born in Ghana in West Africa and moved to the United States with his family as a teenager. His father's work as a preacher required the family to move frequently, and in the process of moving, Ewudzie had to find his way into several new communities from Midwestern Illinois to East Coast New York, and from low-income South Bronx to the more affluent White Plains. In 2012, Ewudzie found himself back in the Midwest and about to embark on a research for a doctoral dissertation in sociology. Already familiar with some of the regions of the United States, Ewudzie had long wanted to see firsthand what life was like in the Deep South. In addition, he was curious about the lives whom we sometimes think as the poorest of the poor, those without a place to live. So he decided to study the homeless population of Jackson, Mississippi. More specifically, he set out to understand how this population, living at the margins of society, managed to get something to eat on a regular basis. Like anyone engaged in sociological investigation, Ewudzie considered a range of research methods. Should he develop a questionnaire, then walk around downtown Jackson asking anyone who appeared to be homeless to fill out one? Should he get an office on the campus of a local college and invite homeless people to come in and sit down for an interview? It was easy to see neither of these strategies would likely work. Besides, Ewudzie wanted to do something more than gather information about eating habits of homeless people. He was eager to experience their social world for himself and discover how they lived, where they slept, and with whom they socialized. So he decided to move to Jackson and immerse himself in the homeless community. In short, he decided to become a participant observer. Ewudzie knew participant observation was the right method for his study, but he was still unsure of the exact methods needed to accomplish this research goal. On his first Monday morning in Jackson, he stopped by the Peaches Cafe. He needed breakfast, and this seemed to be a good choice as any, and it offered the opportunity to try his hand at engaging at local people. A woman introduced herself as Miss Stella, was single-handedly working the grill and serving the food. Ewudzie sat down at the counter and, as the bacon sizzled, tried to figure out what to do next. Should he tell her he was a graduate student in sociology? Should he mention his interest in studying food? After a while, he mustered up the courage to engage in small talk with a couple of guys in the booth behind him. They were talking about the best basketball game that, luckily, he had watched on the television the night before. He chatted with them until the topic of conversation switched to something he knew nothing about, and feeling awkward, he disengaged. His first day on the job already taught him how difficult starting the process of fieldwork can be. When Ewudzie returned to Peaches the following day, the two gentlemen were there. He exchanged greetings with them, falling into a conversation that, this time, covered a wider range of topics. The next day, it seemed almost natural to pick up the conversation with the two men, Miss Stella, and several other customers. Ewudzie was well on his way of becoming a regular. Now he was in a position to strike up a conversation with others and to begin learning about life in Jackson. Researchers called this part of the research experience the process of breaking into the new social scene, a step that takes patience and persistence. One thing that helped in this case was Ewudzie's accent, which identified him as a non-Southerner. Hearing his voice, people were curious and quick to ask him where he was from. When they found out he was from Ghana, the locals, all of whom were African American, wanted to learn about life there. These conversations gave Edwuzi the opening he needed to ask about life in Jackson, but he needed to move ahead because he wanted to focus his study on homeless people. From the contacts he had made in the cafe, he learned about the Opportunity Center, a nearby facility that served homeless people as a day shelter. The next step in the research was to visit the Opportunity Center. When Edwuzi first arrived at the Opportunity Center, affectionately known as the OC, he met Ray and Billy working at the reception desk. He would find out later that at the time they were both homeless. Within a few days, Edwuzi was able to make friends with Ray and Billy. They were eager to help him and offered to provide information about the OC and the people it served. Edwuzi, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, Edwuzi, soon learned that on a typical day, the Opportunity Center served about 100 men and about a dozen women, providing a place to store personal belongings, to make phone calls, to use the bathroom and showers. Further, the OC served as an address that the clients could use to apply for a job or seek government assistance. The facility also was a social center for most of the clients, a place where they could stay informed about how others were doing and also exchange information about new opportunities for food, and places to sleep. Ray and Billy were a good source of information about Jackson's soup kitchens and shelters. They also filled Edwuzi in on various other locations such as parks, churches, bus stations, where people who are homeless eat, sleep, and just hang out. With this new information in hand, Edwuzi knew that the steps that he needed to complete the research. Over several months working in the field for 10 to 12 hours a day, he visited all the facilities and locations and in the process became immersed in the lives of Jackson's homeless men. Billy and Ray's assistance illustrates the importance of key informants in the field research. Such people are not only a source of information but also serve to introduce a researcher to others in the community. Using a key informant allows easy access to that person's social network. Knowing people to contact in each setting and being able to say, I'm a friend of Billy and Ray, they say I should get in touch with you, is obviously very helpful in gaining additional information. But using a key informant also has risk. Because any person has a particular circle of acquaintances, a key informant's guidance is certainly to spin or bias the study in one way or another. In addition, in the eyes of others, the reputation of the informant, whether good or bad, usually rubs off on the investigator. So although a key informant is helpful early on, a skillful participant observer will soon seek a broader range of contacts. Over the months that followed, Edwuzi spent most of the day joining in conversations with homeless people. He learned about their lives and how they made it through the day. As he got to know people better, he explained more about his research project to them. Because he had taken the time to build meaningful relationships with the subjects, most people not only were willing to talk to him, but also offered intimate details about their lives, personal details that a researcher would never have gathered in a single meeting using a questionnaire or even an interview. Edwuzi also credits some of this warm reception to the South's cultural tradition of hospitality. As is typical of researchers who choose the method of participant observation, Edwuzi jotted notes as he engaged in conversations. Sometimes when he couldn't keep the pace of the flow of information, he excused himself to go to the bathroom so he could have a few minutes to write down detailed notes. At times he recorded conversations using his smartphone, and he did only so after asking and receiving the subject's permission. After each day in the field, he spent several evening hours at the apartment, turning his rough notes into a detailed record of his research. As he neared the end of his months in the field, Edwuzi reflected about what he had learned. Some homeless people had relatives living in or near Jackson and spent some time staying with family. But most of the homeless people he had come to know were living on their own and appeared regularly at the OC and at various soup kitchens and homeless shelters. Most of the people he studied were unemployed. Some had income from paid work, but and most received income assistance from the government. He was surprised to learn that they had used the money they had not so much for food as for medical needs and necessities such as clothing, for entertainment, and to supply their addictions to alcohol or other drugs. But perhaps the most surprising findings to come to Edwoozy forthcoming research was that the typical homeless person in Jackson rarely, if ever, went a day without food. 4 or 5 soup kitchens operated in the city on a given day, and church groups and other organizations offered food at least several days each week. Sometimes students from a nearby college would bring leftovers from the campus dining hall to feed the homeless at a nearby park. So as long as a person stayed connected to the social network that revolved around the OC, there was no need to go hungry. At the same time, there was little choice about what to eat. The quality of the food was uneven at best. In addition, food was not available around the clock. Breakfast and lunch were pretty much a sure thing. Dinner was less certain. As a result, most homeless individuals built a stash from meals available earlier in the day to which they could return to later if nothing else was available. From his participant observation research, Edwoozy learned much more than he intended at the outset. He saw the greatest challenge faced by this group of homeless men was not, in fact, a lack of food. Perhaps their immediate concern was limited availability of safe and comfortable shelter. The homeless population of the city was greater than the number of available beds in the shelter, so that, especially in the cold or wet weather, not everyone could find a safe space indoors. A second concern was a lack of public transportation to many places that the homeless people frequented. And looking ahead, Edwoozy concluded that greatest long-term need among homeless was improved literacy skills, which he saw was essential to being able to look for, get, and hold jobs. Research of this kind is often used by officials in governments and other organizations in formulating and redefining public policy. Edwoozy hopes that his research will result in programs that go beyond maintaining homeless people in their present state towards expanding their opportunity to become self-supporting community members. Evaluate. To study the homeless population in Jackson, Mississippi, Joseph Edwoozy chose participant observation as his research method. This was a good choice because he did not have a specific hypothesis to test, nor did he know at the outset exactly what the questions or the issues would turn out to be. Edwoozy was able to complete his study with very little money, although he had to spend long days for many months in the field. By moving to Jackson, then participating in and observing the social life at the city's facility for homeless people, Edwoozy gradually was able to build an understanding and prepare a detailed description of the way of life typical of cities' homeless population. Check your learning. Give an example of a topic for sociological research that would be best studied using an experiment, a survey, and participant observation. Using available data. Existing sources. Page 49. Not all research requires investigators to collect their own data. Sometimes sociologists analyze existing sources, data already collected by others. The most widely used statistic in social sciences are gathered by government agencies. The U.S. Census Bureau carries out a comprehensive statistical study of the U.S. population every 10 years, and this agency also continuously updates a wide range of data about the U.S. population. National Map 2-1 provides a look at the share of the households that filled out and returned their information forms as part of the 2010 National Census. Comparable data about Canada are available from Statistics Canada, a branch of that nation's government. For international data, there are various publications of the UN and the World Bank. In short, data about the whole world are as close as your library or the internet. Using available data, such as government statistics or the findings of individual researchers, saves time and money. This approach has special appeal to sociologists with low budgets. For anyone, however, government data are generally more extensive and more accurate than what most researchers could obtain on their own. But using existing data has problems of its own. For one, available data may not exist in exact form needed. For example, you may be able to find the average salary paid to professors at your school, but not separate figures for the amount paid to women and men. Further, there are always questions about the meaning and accuracy of work done by others. For example, in his classic study of suicide, Emil Durkheim soon discovered that there was no way to know whether a death classified as suicide was really an accident or vice versa. In addition, various agencies use different procedures and categories in collecting data, so comparisons may be difficult. In the end, then, using existing data is a little like shopping for a used car. There are plenty of bargains up there, but you have to shop carefully. Illustration of use of existing sources, A Tale of Two Cities. Why might one city have been home to many famous people and another produced hardly any famous people at all? To those us living in the present, historical data offers a key to unlocking secrets of the past. The award-winning study, Puritan Boston and the Quaker Philadelphia, by E. Digby Baltzell, 1979, is a good example of how a researcher can use available data to do historical research. This story begins when Baltzell made a chance visit to Bowdoin College in Maine. As he walked into the college library, he saw up on the wall 3 large portraits of celebrated author Nathaniel Hawthorne, the famous poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States that no one remembers. He learned that all 3 men were members of the same class at Bowdoin? I don't know. Graduating in 1825. How could it be, Baltzell wondered, that this small college had graduated more famous people in a single year than his own much bigger University of Pennsylvania had graduated in its entire history? To answer this question, Baltzell was soon paging through historical documents to see whether New England had really produced more famous people than his native Pennsylvania. What were Baltzell's data? He turned to Dictionary of American Biography, 20 volumes profiling more than 13,000 outstanding men and women in fields such as politics, law, and the arts. The dictionary told Baltzell who was great, and he realized the longer the biography, the more important the person is thought to be. By the time Baltzell had identified the 75 individuals with the longest biographies, he saw a striking pattern. Massachusetts most by far, with 21 of the 75 top achievers. The New England states combined claimed 31 of the entries. By contrast, Pennsylvania could boast only 2, and all the states in the Mid-Atlantic region had 12. Looking more closely, Baltzell discovered that most of New England's great achievers had grown in and around the city of Boston. Again, in stark contrast, almost no one of comparable standing came from his own Philadelphia, a city with many more people than Boston. What could explain this remarkable pattern? Baltzell drew inspiration from the German sociologist Max Weber, who argued that a region's records of achievement was influenced by its major religious beliefs. In the religious differences between Boston and Philadelphia, Baltzell found the answer to his puzzle. Boston was originally a Puritan settlement founded by people who highly valued the pursuit of excellence and public achievement. Philadelphia, by contrast, was settled by Quakers who believed in equality and avoided public notice. Both the Puritan and the Quakers were fleeing religious persecution in England, but the 2 religions produced quite different cultural patterns. Convinced of humanity's innate sinfulness, Boston's Puritans built a rigid society in which family, church, school regulated people's behavior. The Puritans celebrated hard work as a means of glorifying God and viewed public success as a reassuring sign of God's blessing. In short, Puritanism fostered a disciplined life in which people both sought and respected achievement. Philadelphia's Quakers, by contrast, built their way of life on the belief that all human beings are basically good. They saw little need for strong social institutions to save people from sinfulness. They believed in equality, so that even those who became rich considered themselves no better than anyone else. Thus, rich and poor alike lived modestly and discouraged one another from standing out by seeking fame or running for public office. In Baltz's sociological imagination, Boston and Philadelphia took the form of two social test tubes. Puritanism was poured in one, Quakerism into the other. Centuries later, we can see the different chemical reactions occurred in each case. The two belief systems led to different attitudes towards personal achievement, which in turn shaped the history of each region. Today we can see that Boston's Kennedys, despite being Catholic, are only one of that city's many families who exemplify the Puritan pursuit of recognition and leadership. By contrast, there has never been even one family with such public stature in the entire history of Philadelphia. Baltz's study used scientific logic, but it illustrates the interpretive orientation by showing how people understood their world. His research reminds us that sociological investigation often involves mixing research orientations to fit a particular problem. Evaluation. The main reason Baltzel chose to use existing data is that this is a good way to learn about history. The Dictionary of American Biography offers a great deal of information about people who lived long ago and obviously are not available for interview. At the same time, existing sources were not created with the purpose of answering modern-day sociologists' questions. For this reason, using such document requires a critical eye and a good deal of creative thinking. Check your learning. What other questions about life in the past might you wish to answer using existing sources? What sources might you use to find these answers? Research Methods and Theory, page 52. No matter how sociologists collect their data, they have to turn facts into meanings by building theory. They do this in two ways: inductive logical thought and deductive logical thought. Inductive logical thought is reasoning that transforms specific observation into general theory. In this mode, a researcher's thinking runs from specific to general and goes something like this. I have some interesting data here. I wonder what they mean. Baltz's research illustrates the inductive logical model. His data showed that one region of the country had produced many more high achievers than another. He worked upward from ground level observations to high-flying theory that religious values were a key factor in shaping people's attitudes toward achievement. A second type of logical thought moves downward in opposite direction. Deductive logical thought is reasoning that transforms general theory into specific hypotheses suitable for testing. The researcher's thinking runs from the general to specific. I have this hunch about human behavior. Let's collect some data and put it to test. Working deductively, the researcher first states the theory in the form of a hypothesis, then selects a method by which to test it. To the extent that the data supports the hypothesis, the researcher concludes that the theory is correct. On the other hand, data that refutes the hypothesis suggests that the theory needs to be revised or perhaps rejected entirely. Zimbardo's Stanford County Prison experiment illustrates deductive logic. Zimbardo began with a general theory that a social environment can change human behavior. Then he developed a specific testable hypothesis. Placed in a prison setting, even emotionally well-balanced young men will behave violently. The violence that erupted soon after his experiment began supported Zimbardo's hypothesis. Had his experiment produced friendly behavior between prisoners and guards, his hypothesis clearly would have been wrong. Just as researchers often employ several methods over the course of one study, they typically use both kinds of logical thought. Figure 2.2 illustrates both types of reasoning, inductively building theory from observation and deductively making observations to test a theory. Finally, turning facts into meaning usually involves organizing and presenting statistical data. Precisely how sociologists arrange their numbers affects the conclusions they reach. In short, preparing their results amounts to spinning reality in one way or another. Often we conclude that an argument must be true simply because there are statistics to back it up. However, we must look at the statistics with a cautious eye. After all, researchers chose what data to present. They interpret their statistics, and they may use tables and graphs to steer readers towards particular conclusions. Putting it all together, 10 steps in sociological investigation. We can now summarize this chapter by outlining the 10 steps in the process of carrying out sociological investigation. Each step takes the form of an important question. What is your topic? Being curious and applying sociological perspective can generate ideas for social research at any time and any place. Pick a topic you find interesting and important to study. Number 2, what have others already learned? You are probably not the first person with an interest in the issue you have selected. Visit the library to see what theories and methods other researchers have applied to your topic. In reviewing the existing data, note problems that have come up to avoid repeating past mistakes. Point 3. What exactly are your questions? Are you seeking to explore an unfamiliar social setting, to describe some category of people, to investigate cause and effect among variables? If your study is exploratory or descriptive, identify whom you wish to study, where the research will take place, and what kind of issues you want to explore. If it is explanatory, you must also formulate the hypothesis to be tested and operationalize each variable. Point 4. What will you need to carry out the research? How much time and money are available to you? Is special equipment or training necessary? Will you be able to complete the work yourself? You should complete all these questions as you plan the research project. Point 5. Are there ethical questions? Not all research raises serious ethical questions, but you must be sensitive to this possibility. Can the research cause harm or threaten anyone's privacy? How might you design the study to minimize the chances of injury? Will you promise anonymity to the subject? If so, how will you ensure that anonymity will be maintained? Point 6. What method will you use? Consider all research strategies as well as combinations of methods. Keep in mind that the best method depends on the kinds of questions you are asking as well as the resources available to you. Point number 7. How will you record the data? Your research method is a plan for data collection. Record all information accurately in a way that will make sense later. It may be some time before you actually write up the results of your work. Watch out for any bias that may creep into the research. Point number 8. What do the data tell you? What do the data tell you? Should it be does? What does the data tell you? Study the data in terms of initial questions and decide how to interpret the data you have collected. If your study involves a specific hypothesis, you must decide whether the data you collected requires you to confirm, reject, or modify the original hypothesis. Keep in mind that there are many ways, may be several ways to look at your data, depending on which theoretical approach you use, and you should consider them all. Point number 9. What are your conclusions? Prepare a final report stating your conclusions. How does your work advance sociological theory? Does it suggest ways to improve research methods? Does your study have policy implications? What would the general public find interesting in your work? Finally, evaluate your own work. What problems arose during the research process? What questions were left unanswered? Point number 10. How can you share what you've learned? Consider submitting your research paper to a campus newspaper or magazine, or making a presentation to your class, a campus gathering, or perhaps a meeting of professional sociologists. The point is to share what you have learned with others and let them respond to your work.